Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
And we are recording. Hector Salva, welcome to Weird Web Radio. It is awesome to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Lonnie.
Hey, it's working this time. Inside joke for everybody. They're shaking their head. They don't know what we're talking about. Podcasting 101, folks. Just be prepared for things to not go exactly as you plan all the time. So, real quick about Hector. Born and raised in a family of brujos, witch doctors, healers, and sorcerers, my kind of people, that practiced 21 divisions, Sanse, and Puerto Rican Espiritismo. Hector Salva, also known as Papa Hector, started training as a brujo in 1989 and initiated his family lineages of 21 divisions and Sanse. He was raised by his grandmother. Is it Doña?
Yep.
How do you say her name? Doña Juana Acevedo?
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Awesome.
That's correct.
Bruja and Espiritista. In 2003, Papa Hector was initiated into Haitian voodoo as a Hungan. I'm not sure how to say this one either. What was that? Hey, I'm glad you're here to say it. And a high priest of the Ason lineage. Papa Hector is the author of HectorSalva.com, internet's largest source of information on Haitian, Dominican, and Puerto Rican voodoo traditions. He's also the author of Las 21 Divisiones.com. I guess that would be what? Las 21 Divisiones.com?
Yep.
And SanseReligion.com, and over a half a dozen other spiritual websites. You're a busy dude. In addition to the author's strong online presence, he teaches workshops domestically and internationally. That is a bio, my friend.
Oh, yeah.
I dig it. I should have practiced some of the Spanish before I read that out.
No, you did pretty good.
Hey, thanks. Yeah. I didn't plan on starting here, but as I was reading this, I got to thinking, I'm like, man, you're born into a family of brujos, witch doctors, healers, and sorcerers. Now, the witch doctors, healers, and sorcerers is in parentheses after brujos. So brujos is kind of an all-encompassing word for these things, correct?
Correct.
What's it like growing up in a family like that? Most folks don't get that kind of experience.
It's fun. It's crazy. It's always something new and different going on. It's like a fun kind of controlled chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and before we go too far, before I forget, I want to give a shout out to Gia over at Weiser Books for helping connect us and make this show possible. Anytime that Gia has helped open that doorway, she's going to get proper honor and respect from me.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Gia.
Yeah, thank you, Gia. Yeah. So I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about mediums in particular. So the book, your new book is Espiritismo, Puerto Rican Mediumship and Magic. And my first thought when I saw this on the list at Weiser Books was, what makes it Puerto Rican? Like, how does it get that unique flavor, you know? Because I think most people know what a medium is, but before we make such assumptions, break down what a medium is and how does it become something that needs to be recognized as its own distinct thing as Espiritismo.
Okay. So a medium is someone who can communicate with the spiritual world. And there's various types of mediums. There's mediums who can range in all forms of communication, as well as working with the energies of the spiritual world. That's basically the basic definition of a medium, someone who can communicate with the spiritual world, spirits in particular. Now, what makes a medium a part of Puerto Rican Espiritismo is that Puerto Rican Espiritismo has a certain framework of viewing the world, a certain viewpoint. But aside from the viewpoint, there's also spiritual guides or spirits that we connect with in particular in order to help the process of development. The difference between mediumship just in a general form and, let's say, in Puerto Rican Espiritismo is that in many places mediumship is looked on for various other purposes, whereas in Espiritismo we look to mediumship as a tool that helps us within our process of spiritual and life development.
Okay, that makes sense. Growing up in a family the way you did, when did the reality of spirits kind of hit you?
For me, the reality of the spirits hit me really early on. My first memories that I can remember was about 3 to 4 years old, seeing
Oh, wow.
spirits floating around and seeing people moving or walking around that weren't there. And my grandmother basically when I would tell her about it, she basically would say to me, like, those things that you're seeing, those are true or real, but those are not things that you should talk to everyone about. You need to know who to tell and who not to tell. It's not good to talk about it. So that was my first kind of introduction to the spirits. Aside from, naturally, I don't remember it as much, but I've been told where I was regularly taken to rituals and to ceremonies at even younger ages than that. So I was around the spirits from that viewpoint, but my personal experience was from seeing the spirits outside of a window.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that you physically see them as well as you and I are looking at each other, or do you sense them and just see them in your mind? Like, how does that actually break down? And I think it's important to have those discussions because there are people out there who may be having similar experiences, but they don't have the language to express what's happening, or they doubt their experience.
Exactly. So mediums can see spirits internally and externally. And internally, I mean by inside the mind's eye. Externally, I mean just like seeing you in front of me. Now, when a medium is going through the process of their gifts developing, it's not uncommon for them to kind of see them in either or form or both. As the medium becomes more and more developed, however, it's also not uncommon for the external apparition to fade away.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because most people focus on having an external vision, okay? But in reality, an external vision is just the projection onto the world screen of an internal vision. Right? And sometimes that medium who's getting that might not be able to differentiate. And so for that reason, an external vision is provided. But as mediumship becomes often more and more developed, there's less and less external visions because there's not a need for them. Right? And they may still happen, and they will happen when things are of particular importance or of particular note, but they're not as frequent. Why? Because it takes more energy, both from the medium and from the spirit communicator, to produce a outward apparition.
Okay. Yeah. Other than a couple instances in my own like paranormal investigations and things that I seen with my physical eyes an external apparition or appearance of a ghost or some sort of spirit. When I've done my sorcery and my magical work over the last many years, for me, and it's always been a knowing, and I thought that was really cool that you included that in your book, because I think that's often a neglected aspect of working with spirits is, the language of teaching these things and talking about these things always comes back to seeing or hearing, that kind of thing. But sometimes people like me, we just kind of know what we know. It comes to you in that way.
Absolutely. Knowing is a very important ability. And in fact, for me, and I believe for everyone I've ever taught, you need the foundation of knowing. Okay. Because you can be a seer, someone who sees visuals, but without the knowing, what's going to happen is you're going to have a heavy doubt about what you see, right? So knowing is a very foundational ability, and it is a lot of people neglect the fact that actually knowing is more than enough. You don't need a whole bunch of bells and whistles, because when you know, you know. You just know. Don't nobody have to can't nobody sway you or move you any other way. And even when what you know is wrong, it doesn't really matter, because you know it, and you know it so thoroughly that a lot of times you can take that wrong and transform it into a right.
Yeah.
Right. But even if what you know is right, if what you think you know is right and you're walking on shaky ground because you don't actually know it, you can take that right information and still cause it to not produce you crap. It could still cause no production because you don't have the strength in knowing.
Yeah. This is something I've always warned people with divination. Divination is an important thing to me. It's a huge part of my life. But I'm always aware that sometimes, especially when working with spirit, that divination can force a false narrative into a situation where you're trying to plug in exactly what that little book said this card means, or
Exactly.
that situation. There needs to be more intuition and more knowing involved in those practices.
So divination in our tradition is meant to be training wheels, divinational tools. And a lot of people speak about that, but don't practice it in reality, meaning they get hooked or stay with the training wheels, right? Eventually the training wheels are meant to fall off. And you could still use them if you find them, sentimentally, you have a sentimental connection with it, right? However, I agree with you, but it can also even happen with intuition. That's why in our tradition, we recognize something called false intuition, because the mind is what interprets the messages. And oftentimes the mind will want to skew or will misinterpret based on what the mind wants you to see, based on the system of perception and reality that you already hold. So I know that was a bit much, but
no.
Yeah.
I'm curious though, how do you discern between a good intuition and a false intuition then?
Okay, so false intuitions are based on fear. Right? And so false intuitions are always fear based, and false intuitions are always reactionary. They're not responsive. There's a very distinct difference between response and reaction, right? A response requires total awareness, which is what makes it a response, right? You're actually being responsible. That's where the same word comes from, for the totality of the energy that's there, because you're actually totally aware. Versus reaction. Reaction comes from an outer external trigger, right? So reaction is a movement, an act, as a movement, as an effect of a cause, right? So that's one major point of false intuition, is that false intuition basically works on fear. And fear has many, many forms and many, many ways to creep its way in. And you can actually believe that what you're working on is not fear, when in fact it's just fear in one of its many forms, wearing one of its many masks. So true intuition, to develop it or to remove false intuition, is actually a process through which we go through in our training and development within Espiritismo, to drop away the false intuition. Because it's not uncommon for false intuition and true intuition to mix and meld together. And then you kind of can't separate the wheat from the shaft.
Okay. Now, how common is Espiritismo in Puerto Rico or within, uh, even in the West? I guess as folks have moved around and migrated to different areas, do they take it with them?
So, Espiritismo in its many forms has some commonality. However, in its Puerto Rican form or in Puerto Rico, as of this point, and part of the reason I wrote the book is that it's become a tradition that's slowly actually very quickly fading away. And as I wrote in the book, there's a long history as to why that is. But just about 100 years ago, there used to be a saying that 99% of Puerto Ricans were all espiritista, we're all practitioners. So, but there was a huge campaign that went against these religions, basically no different than more so modern day witch hunts, right? That lasted up until the 80s, right? And so, because of that, there's been our tradition is kind of faded. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book, in order to not allow it to be one of the many mystical spiritual things that kind of ends up fading into the background as people pass away that had the knowledge.
What has been the response to your book? Are you finding a lot more interest, or people who are just saying, "I didn't even realize this was something from our own culture"?
Yeah, so I've had a huge outpouring of support and positive response. I had actually had people asking me to write such a book for like 20 years. And it's just like the time hadn't come yet for me to write such a book. I'm very careful about, if you read the book, I'm very careful about what I write, because I understand
Mm-hmm.
that, especially in the world of the West, once something's written, it's almost considered like Bible truth, right? And so
Yeah.
if it's written, it doesn't matter if it's not, if it's wrong, it's now just become a truth. And if enough people believe a lie, it actually does become a truth.
Mm-hmm.
And then the truth itself becomes the lie.
Yeah.
Right? So I that's what took me so long to end up putting out this book, making sure that what I wrote and when I wrote, it was actually clean, clear, true, and away from anything that maybe I had personally that might have skewed my vision, right? And really having been fully in depth through and through. So that that's one. And then the second thing is that I've had a huge outpouring from people in Puerto Rico, from Puerto Ricans, and people in these in Espiritismo, as well as similar related traditions, just love the book, support the book. They're very happy. They're like, wow, I didn't know this part of it, or I didn't know, or my grandmother did this, or my uncle did this, or my mother did this, but they always kept it hidden from us, etc. And I've been trying to find my roots, or I've had these experiences, right? And I've been trying to understand them. And that's come from people within and outside of the Puerto Rican community. The beautiful thing about Espiritismo is that I call it the science of the spirit, which means the science of consciousness as well as the spiritual world. And so it really gives us a foundation that can apply no matter what religious or spiritual background that you may have.
I know one thing that I enjoyed in your book was the history of the indigenous people of Puerto Rico. I never knew who they were, or really looked into it. Um, and that was a interesting way that you included their history, and then how that spins into more modern practices. I really enjoyed that part of it.
Oh, definitely. A lot of people are unaware of the native people or the indigenous people of the Caribbeans. And as I kind of covered in the book, for a long time, in many places, it was actually believed that they had been wiped out. But in reality, it was later became people knew that it was not that they got wiped out, it was that they just got dropped as a classification from the census.
Isn't that crazy
Right?
how that happens?
And so it was like, we're no longer counting these people as their own group. We're just going to count them along with this group.
Mm-hmm. And it only takes the peculiar thing you learn about people and how they identify as who they are in history. It only takes a generation or two to completely transform that identity in people.
Identity is really moldable. And it's basically because identity is false. And so, because identity is false, it's a false creation, it's very easy to mold. And since identity, in many ways, are created by your governments, religions, socio-economic situations, those people also have a control over your identity and how you identify.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's talk about spirits a little bit more. I mean, the book is heavily spirit focused, obviously. I mean, a book about mediumship. Note that I made, I wanted to talk about. It says that there are spirits of light and spirits of darkness, but both use light to their purposes. So, in Espiritismo, how are you taught to identify the difference between the two? How do you make that discernment?
So in Espiritismo, as you develop, you're given practices. Espiritismo is very practice-centric. So it's very practice-centered, where a person is given practices, and as they're being mentored, they're being monitored, and practices are being layered upon each other in order for a person to learn the ability to discern and not judge. And to be able, it's a fine line between discernment and judgment. Some spirits can almost seem like they're negative, but actually not be negative spirits, right? It's just like sometimes people might think someone else is like a negative, angry, aggressive person, but in reality, that person, maybe they're actually a big teddy bear, right? And it's just that energy, that's again a judgment. So discernment is actually what we consider a spiritual gift that we work on the process with the person to develop that gift to be to have the ability to say, okay, this is this type of spirit, this is that type of spirit.
Mm-hmm. So why would you interact with these spirits? What would be the purpose or the goal?
The purpose of interacting with the spirits is that either you can play the game or the game can get played on you. It's okay, right?
So what's the game?
So the game of life is that you're always being influenced, and you're always being influenced by both visible and invisible influencers. And so the spirits are part of those invisible influencers, which we say, what you can see, you can fight. What you can't see, you can't fight, right? So what you can't see is more dangerous than what you can see, right? So the ability to turn around and see it and to be able to see how it actually influences your life and how much spirits and spiritual energies influence the way you live and the way you have your experience. That gives you the ability to start to have control over what you call your life, right? Right now, as you are, without, meaning an individual without an awareness of those influences, they're basically being manipulated or influenced by these various influences without their awareness. So there's nothing that they can do about it, right? But once you can become aware of this other energies and other consciousnesses that have their own wills in your environment and how they influence you, now you can start to get yourself out of being controlled by this force or that force or this or that, so that you actually have control of your life. Many people have control over their lives in a form of illusion, right? There's the illusion of control over your life. But if I can say, right, Lonnie is crap, right? And Lonnie gets upset, right? Who controls Lonnie, right? Who is controlling you? If you can go to work and you're happy, and when you enter work and people give you dirty looks or say little things and you're getting all upset, who's controlling you then, right? So people are spirits. Spirits are what majority of us call spirits, are no different than spirits of people that are no longer incarnated, no longer have a physical vessel, right? And the same way that other people can influence us, they will, and they do also influence us.
My favorite part of the book, by far, because it was just so fun and interesting to read, was when you were talking about, and I hope I don't say this wrong, Quadro.
Yeah, you said that awesome.
Okay, Quadro. Talking about the Quadro. Fascinating concept. And the reason I found it so interesting is, I do a lot of spirit work in my practice, and I have a general offering I make to my allies, those who aid, guide, and protect me. And I've got some that I name, and I've got general classes of beings and so far that I do. What I found so fun and interesting about this particular part of your tradition was the different categories of spirits that are in there. And I really want to dig into this. So a Quadro is something that we're all born with, but we don't all get that whole catalog of spirits, right?
Exactly.
Aha. So for folks listening who haven't read the book, they're like, what the fuck are they talking about? What's a Quadro? Why does it matter?
Okay. So a Quadro in English, we would say it's your spiritual frame. So it's the spirits that walk with you, all the spirits, and those are spiritual guides, those are ancestors, those are mysteries of God, all those spirits that walk with you, both positive and negative, as well as your spiritual abilities, which are also make up a part of your Quadro, your light, as we discussed earlier. And so your Quadro is basically what I would say is the equivalent of your spiritual body plus all your spiritual family. The same way you're born with a family over on this end of the world, you have your mother, your brother, your sisters, and all these people that you were just born into connection with. So was your spirit have all these connections with it as well.
How does someone know and find out what type of spirit is in their Quadro within their frame?
So there's a variety of ways that people start to find out the spirits in their Quadro. So one is the spirits can start to tell you themselves, right? And so they can come to you in the form of dreams. They can come to you in the forms of what we were speaking about earlier, your spiritual abilities of seeing, hearing, knowing, these other spiritual abilities. They can come to you through other people, right? I've seen that happen where other people I've heard stories where they're like, I'm walking down the street and somebody comes up to me and says, hey, this spirit is with you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's other confirming facts that prove that that's true, right? So that's one way. They can also come to you if you are a spiritual person who does participate in spiritual practices. There's lots of practices. It doesn't matter what you do in the world that take you into the spiritual realm in the form of journeying, astral travel, etc. So there's that method. Also, you can find out the spirits in your Quadro, which also often happens is through having an investigation or a consultation with an espiritista. They're going to be able to look into your Quadro and be like, okay, these are the spirits that are with you, etc. So some people also do that to confirm, to help give confirmation of what I know I have with me. The third thing is the spirits can also come and tell you during a ritual, in the sense of when we have rituals, spirits take over people's body And it's kind of different, slightly different than what many people call channeling, because in many cases there's a loss of consciousness. And the spirits are now possessing that person's body and can communicate directly with another person and be like, Lonnie, these are the spirits you have. You have this spirit and that spirit with you. Now, as you develop spiritually, we say that your cuadro is something like you're slowly getting to know it more and more and reveal it more and more. And I'm sure that has happened to you on your own spiritual journey, right? Where you started off with maybe certain spirits that kind of got you introduced to things, etc. And maybe they were a major part of your practice. And as you grew, right? Maybe some of them fell away, some of them stayed and rooted and got more grounded. Maybe other spirits kind of showed up to start to help you during another part of your development. And then again, maybe some of them fell away, some of them kept. So as you're growing, you're ending up with a tribe of spirits that is kind of yours.
Doesn't that sound fun, folks? Now, I'm going to grab the book because we're really going to dig into this. I have bookmarked that section because it is so interesting. Some of my favorites in here. First up were the nannies, Madamas. Is that how you say that?
Oh, yeah.
Madamas? Yeah.
Yep.
All right, the nannies. This was really interesting. So, could you tell folks what that particular spirit or spirit group is, I guess?
Yeah. So La Madamas, very popular group of spirits in Puerto Rican Espiritismo. I would probably say the most popular.
Yeah.
Right. And she's also, not only is she known here in Espiritismo, but there's figures and images, and I've heard practitioners speaking of her even in the American South. So the Madama was at one time a very important figure in many households when slavery was a part of the world, right? Where there was a nanny and a manager of the house. And she took care of the children and she managed the house. But along with her, she often knew a lot of herbalism, a lot of kitchen witchery. She was often a fortune teller or a seer, and she had her abilities and her powers. She could help heal people as an herbalist. So what happened is that these spirits became elevated, and as people passed, right, people, their descendants and people who were cared for by Las Madamas started to render service to them. And so over time, this is about the evolution of how a spirit ends up becoming evolved. And this spirit ends up becoming evolved to a point where it becomes a major group of spirits, right, who come to help us. And La Madama, what I love about her is she's very down to earth. She's a tough talker. She's a little rough around the edges, right? And she reminds me of like basically a grandmother who's gonna love you a lot, but who will not have a problem like slapping you with a wooden spoon if needed, right? And she's very down to earth. She's very blunt, and she's very loving and nurturing. She's a spirit that's very motherly over those who work with her. And she's a spirit who's really going to give it to you, whether you like it or not, whatever is actually in your best interest, whether or not you're ready to hear it, right? Because, when you're a grandmother at that point, because they have very much a grandmother energy. So when you're like a grandmother, you're just at that age where you just kind of like, you can say what you need to say and everybody better love you for it. And, if anything, you can just like shove some sugar in their mouth and, it resolves everything. So La Madama is one of my favorite spirits. It was my grandmother's main spirit. It was many people who I grew up and trained with. It was their main spirit. she's a very beautiful spirit.
Yeah, I really like that. In heathenry, we have a concept similar to this called the Disir, and they are the mothers, the grandmothers and the mothers. And even throughout the continental Europe and during the Roman period in Germanic areas, they know of a group of spirits that were called the matrones, the mothers. I think this is a very powerful and energy that's been with humanity for a very, very long time. I mean, one of my favorite lines from the movie The Crow was, the name for God on the hearts and lips of children is mother. And it's got that real powerful impact that way. You pointed out in the book, there's a bit of controversy around this group of spirits, though, that some folks say that not everyone can work with them.
The difference between Espiritismo and many other Caribbean traditions is that Espiritismo is what we would consider an open practice, right? We're here for all of humanity. As you could see and as you witnessed in the book, there's spirits from all over the globe and all over the world within Espiritismo. Unfortunately, also in the world, you always have some people who they want to control the spiritual path or journey of others, right? I am of the vision or of the sight that if those spirits come to you, then it's for you. Okay? If that spirit wants to work with you, it will work with you. And if it doesn't, it will not. So I do not need to worry about whether you should or shouldn't deal with something. Right? Because either one of two things are going to happen. One is you're not going to get any response, right? Which is actually a blessing. And then eventually you're like, this isn't working for me, so I'm not going to do it anymore. Or number two, the second thing that could happen is maybe you have a negative result, meaning a kind of a backlash. In which case, maybe you learn a lesson and maybe you say, like, maybe this is not for me. Or maybe you learn a spiritual lesson you actually needed to learn. And that transforms it for it to be for you.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't, there's controversy about, especially now in current times, current climate, current cultural climate, about who can practice what, who can say what, who can do what, all of these things in the spiritual realm, in the social realm, it's just all over this place, especially now. And I'm of the position of like, I'm going to live and I'm going to let live. You do you, I do me. I'm not going to get in your way and hurt you. You don't get in my way and hurt me. And we can all do well.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm with you on that one. Yeah. We have similar problems in heathenry. There are people who call themselves folkish, just say you have to have only Northern European ancestors or some such nonsense. And then there's folks like me who are inclusive and say, no, if these sort of spirits and gods are calling to you, then who am I to tell you no? So, I mean, I can understand why some folks in indigenous practices want to have a little bit more protection around those. I think they should be approached with proper respect and honor and for the tradition.
Absolutely.
The last thing in the world I want to see your book do is turn somebody or have somebody running around with it saying, I'm an espiritista now,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So no, I agree 100%. And I agree that, cultures do need to be protected, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I can protect something without, and I protect it by practicing it properly.
Yes.
And by teaching other people the proper way of practice, rather than by being concerned with attacking the individuals who are not doing things properly. Because that's not going to stop those individuals from continuing that often, right? And if it's not them, it'll be some other people who will end up doing it.
That's an
right?
excellent point.
So I can't go after each individual, but what I can do is I can teach things properly. I can present things in the proper way. I can work properly. And then whatever happens with those individuals, that's with them. But at least this is also being preserved over here. My energy is not becoming distracted in that, because in dealing with those little individuals, that's not going to help me preserve the tradition.
I really, really like that point. It's something I've made so many times. I think our energy is far better spent doing it in a good and wonderful way, and honoring the spirits and the traditions in a good and wonderful way, rather than screaming at the doorway about what we're not.
Yeah. So that's one. And another thing is that many of these spiritual traditions, not all, but many spiritual traditions, believe in reincarnation. Okay. And I think it ridiculous. However, I am a little crazy like this. Okay. So I think it quite ridiculous if you are a believer in reincarnation, or you hold on to reincarnation. I think it quite ridiculous for you to have basically most things: racism, sexism, religious discrimination, etc. Right now, I'm an Espiritista. Maybe in the last time I was a Muslim, maybe I was a Jew, maybe I was this, maybe I was that, maybe I was this, maybe I was that, etc., etc. So I often find it funny in certain cases where I see certain people like believing in reincarnation in one hand, but then having like racism, sexism, homophobia, all these other things on the other hand.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So
that's funny. It's a shame that I don't produce the video on these. They could see just how big you smile and grin when you say that. Okay. Yeah. I just kind of want to unpack that, because I thought it was an important point in your book, and it was one worth addressing, how inclusive Espiritismo is. Another class of spirits you brought up, and we talked about this a little bit before the show started. I've been on a hunt for a little Butler statue ever since. Are the Butlers? I totally dig this concept. This made me so happy to read about this general class of beings. I was like, fuck yes.
yes. I love the Madamos, which are the Butlers. I love them very much, especially because I have no other way to put this, but basically, like, a lot of people easily appreciate the mothers, the nannies, the grandmothers, right? That's really something that gets easily appreciated in the world, often and very lavishly, and it should be. However, something that often also gets neglected is what I call like the grandfathers, right? The butlers, individuals who very silently, very stealthily are able to manage and do so many things and resolve people's problems and get things done for people and organized without lots of show, without lots of pompousness, as they say, right? And that's one of the things about the butlers. And I think that it is a neglected group of spirits in the spiritual world that often doesn't get enough credit there or attention, because the butlers are a group of spirits of very high organization, right? And they're able to help people in a lot of things. A lot of people deal with overwhelm, and they deal with anxiety that comes from overwhelm, right? The butlers is one of these types of spirits that could help someone in those types of situations.
Yeah.
And for me, like my grandfathers, they weren't butlers, but they I connect them because they remind me of many ways of that same energy. Very stoic, right?
Yeah.
Very stoic, very like, Lonnie, I got this. Don't worry about it. And it gets done and accomplished, and it's like, here, it's done. So that, and both of my grandfathers were very stoic individuals, and that's one thing that I always loved about the Butlers, is that they're very stoic and very like, we're gonna get it done, and just doing it in a classy way,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like, doing it with class.
Yeah. No, it was very, very, very compelling and interesting concept to me. I work with different classes of beings, and I'm always looking for, the ones that could be more helpful. And I thought, man, that rang bells. I totally dig it. Um, does are there important holidays or like dates that are involved with the Spiritismo?
So in Espiritismo, there are various holidays that are celebrated by many Espiritistas. However, one is, they're not particularly generally Espiritista. Is that many Espiritistas are also Catholic.
Gotcha.
In our countries, they were Catholic based. And so, in many ways, we have a lot of Catholicism that's involved in our traditions. And so, there's feast days of the various saints. And so, if you were to have one of those saints as one of the spirits you work with, or one of your patrons, you would probably participate in those types of celebrations that is often held by the Catholic Church. And you may also have rituals and celebrations in your own home for those spirits that you work with. That's one. And the second thing is, another major time for most Espiritista growing up was always like the solstice, the summer solstice, particularly, and the beginning of the year, New Year's, end of the year from the 28th, which is called the Day of the Innocents, and up through the Day of Kings, which is January 6th. And so that's always been a very important time, and the summer solstice. Easter as well. In many ways, we follow the Catholic calendar because Catholicism was imposed very severely for a long time. So our Espiritismo became blended or mixed with Catholicism. Now, one thing I want to point, because many people ask me this, is, however, you don't have to be a Catholic to practice Espiritismo. You don't have to participate in Catholicism. And the Catholicism can actually be drawn out, and still you're practicing Espiritismo. However, if you are practicing in a Espiritismo community, you're going to naturally need to be familiar with these Catholic items, Catholic concepts, Catholic terminologies, as well as some Catholic ritual, in order for you to understand what the community is doing at large, and for you to be able to grasp everything that's going on.
Gotcha. Okay. Is there? I know there's one that you bring up in the book. I'm curious. An important ritual that is common amongst most Espiritista practitioners.
Mm-hmm. So some of our most important rituals are called spiritual reunions or spiritual masses, as well as veladas. Veladas would, in English, equivalent to vigil, but it's actually, these are the rituals that are done to hold an open forum for the spirits and their messages. And this is a time where mediums come together with the public in a safe space to allow that open forum to happen, for healing to happen, for messages of the future, the past, whatever's needed for healing to happen, and resolution of life issues, as well as spiritual development. So that's one space. Also in veladas is very often used as a space to do healing work, which means to deal with negative entities or spirits that a person has involved or attached to them, and to be able to work and resolve those issues, heal those issues, both for the spirit as well as for the person.
Okay. In those, in that format, is it sort of, like people gathered around similar to way like a church would be, like people are seated and the mediums are in the front? Are people addressing the mediums with questions? Like, how does that work?
Mm-hmm. So in that format, usually the way it is that mediums are seated behind a white table in the front. And there's various objects on the table and bowls of water and things to help the mediums do what they're going to do. Everyone else is usually seated kind of in rows in front, very much like a church would be. It begins with opening prayers, various prayers to God, and opening prayers to open up the ritual, etc. Once that's done, then the mediums will begin to communicate with their spirits through whatever gifts or abilities that they have, and they will begin to call people out from the congregation and be like, hey, Lonnie, come up to the front, and then communicate whatever the spirits have to say. And you may be called up to the front various times by various mediums, or you may be called up once to the front, and all various mediums may all talk to you about everything they're receiving from the various spirits. And basically that happens throughout the course of the ritual until all the messages have been given. Now, spirits may also show up by coming through someone's vessel or their body, at which point those spirits are going to communicate and do whatever it is that they're going to do. So that happens until all messages is completed, and then basically there's prayers and a small ritual to close the ceremony, and then basically we disperse.
So, say someone listening to the show decides they want to get involved in Espiritismo. Is this something that they can go learn on their own, or do they need to find a teacher? How's that work?
Yes. So generally, here's what happens for most people. For most people who are mediums or have mediumship abilities or are looking in that direction, oftentimes your abilities and things are going to start to open up and unravel on their own as a part of things that happen to you in life. At some point, you would go and you would look for a teacher. Typically, Espiritismo is learned through apprenticeship. So you would look for a mentor to apprentice with. Oftentimes, you could do this by having consultations with various different espiritistas, looking for where that click, your proper home, where you're aligned, what works for you. That's one way. Another way that was very popular, especially in the olden times, where there were tons of Espiritismo centers all over the island, would be for you to go to various spiritual centers when they're having open public rituals, and for you to slowly go to be able to find the mentor for yourself. Yes, right? Yeah. And so those are both ways. And you could also, even nowadays, if you can find places that holds open public rituals, you could go to such a ritual, see what the spirits have to say to you, see what guidance you're given, and also look for a mentor. Typically, it's you work with a mentor, and a mentor lets you know, like, hey, when you're ready for this or you're ready for that, they're guiding you, they're teaching you, they're showing you the practices, etc. Now, the problem with learning Espiritismo on your own is that maybe at one time, maybe it was possible, but these days, especially like I wrote in the book, because the tradition is so faded, like this is one of the only books on Puerto Rican I think it's the only book on Puerto Rican Espiritismo in English or Spanish. So how you could go to learn on your own, I don't know where do you get what you need in order to learn the practices, etc. So yeah, exactly. You could go get the book. It'll give you a good start. I tried to give a good start there at the end of the book for people who are interested and who want to get started on their journey. But basically, yeah, it's typically a practice where you're apprentice with someone, and Yeah.
Okay. Um, one thing I always like to talk about, whether this is a spiritismo involved or not, it isn't all that important with the question. I just want to make sure I fit it in. Is that, every place has its own local history, its own folklore, and there are important places that are associated with local folklore, or places that you find that personally resonate, that touch on that energy. So some place that you've lived, what is one of your favorite pieces of folklore associated with a location that someone could actually visit?
Okay. Somewhere where I've lived and have experienced some local folklore.
Yeah, some place where you've lived that what's one of your favorite parts of their local folklore that's associated with a location that people could actually visit, or that you visited yourself?
Okay, one of my actual favorite places that I lived and I had a spiritual experience was in outside of Albuquerque.
Okay.
And in Albuquerque, there is spirits that are known as, I hope I'm saying it properly, the Kachina. And these are really huge beings that live oftentimes in the desert. So in I lived for some time in Albuquerque and I started to experience a whole bunch of dreams with these beings, which I didn't know what they were. And from what I understand, these beings are the ones that oftentimes kick up the dust storms
Mm.
and kick up the sandstorms that kind of go on when the desert gets all windy and stuff and they're upset. So, in at twice when riding through the desert to get to another area in New Mexico, I had like a quick sight of the huge being that I couldn't even see the top of,
Oh, wow.
right? And so that was one of my favorite places and one of my favorites where it was very much touched by something that was there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I did not. I've heard of them before. I didn't realize that they were like huge.
Yeah,
That escaped
giant.
my attention somehow. Yeah. I'd be curious if anyone has had a similar experience out in New Mexico. If you have, shoot me a message and let me know. All right. I think we've come to the end of the regular broadcast. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for giving me part of your day. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Okay.
It's been awesome.
Is there something that I should have asked, something you'd like to talk about that I didn't cover?
So basically, just really shortly, what I would like to say is that with Espiritismo, it's very much aside from what we have there presented in the book, and I presented it in some ways in the book as well. Espiritismo also has a side to it which is hermetic, right? And it's very deep within the hermetic knowledge. So Espiritismo has a pathway to reach wholeness. And this is something that a lot of times people in the West go to the East to seek wholeness. And sometimes those methods don't work simply because people from the East have been programmed and cultured by the East. And so some of their methods are made for people who are dealing in that environment. And so in the West, we also have this tradition of Espiritismo, which is mystical and hermetic in nature, which also has the capacity to help people reach wholeness or enlightenment or bliss, the bliss state or the ecstatic state, the unity with the divine, just like the traditions in the East. And that's actually a major thing about the process of Espiritismo, including dealing with the spirits. It's actually all part of a process of learning to become a completely integrated being. And that's one thing that is often gets missed by people in seeing Espiritismo, simply because we have lots of stuff and we have lots of magic as well, and solutions, etc. But magic is actually part of the byproducts of the spiritual tradition.
Espiritismo, I hope we captured that in the process of this interview, is a complete tradition. It offers everything that you would look for within a tradition. So if folks are out there and interested in Espiritismo and they want to get started in your particular methods or reach out to you as a teacher, even, like, how do people find you?
So I'm all over, as you mentioned in the beginning, the web. The easiest way I say these days is you could go to hectorsalva.com. There you'll be able to see my blog. It links up to a lot of my other stuff. I'm all over Facebook, all the social media. So Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Hungan Hector or Papa Hector. You can reach me. You can also reach me at help@mysticalwork.com is our email. We have a YouTube channel. And like you mentioned in the beginning, there's over a dozen websites. So basically, if you look up my name, there's no way to miss me. Like, I'm impossible to miss. So like that. And yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure that I get some of those links up in the show notes so people can find you easier. Okay. Well, thank you all for listening. As always, it's been great to give us a part of your day. If you want to hear the rest of this conversation, you're going to have to go to weirdwebradio.com, click the membership, or go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio and gain access to that and so much more. Stay weird out there, my friends. And now it's bonus audio time. Are you ready, Hector Salva?
Definitely.
He says he's ready. Okay. First question. This could be interesting based on what I've read in your book and our conversation. What famous person's resting place do you most want to visit?
I would say that the famous person's resting place I would most want to visit would probably be...
Do you want to hear how they just answered that question? What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit? That and many others, including what they think about the afterlife, what they may or may not do in cemeteries, what are their traditions, magical practices that have to do with the dead, folklore that surrounds their homes, and so much more, available for only $5. $5 a month. Even if I make more than one episode in a month, it's still just $5 a month at patreon.com/weirdwebradio, or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. You can find me on Instagram at weirdwebradio. You can find me on Facebook as Weird Web Radio, or come join the new, fun, and exciting Weird Web Radio Facebook group. Thank you again for being here. Stay weird out there, my friends.